We recommend this product be installed by a competent gunsmith.
Modification of your firearm may nullify the warranty of the firearm's manufacturer.
No liability is expressed or implied for damage or injury which may occur from improper use or installation of this product.
You are responsible for the safe handling, legalities, and use of your firearm.
Warning: always wear safety glasses when working on firearms. Before we begin the reassembly process, I want to point out the differences between the Apex Sear spring and the factory Sear spring. The factory Sear spring has more of a bronze color to it and has thicker wire. The Apex spring is more of a silver color and has a thinner wire. To reassemble the Sear housing, first I'll take the Sear pin, I'll put it into the Sear housing from one side, doesn't matter which one, where it just barely protrudes in, and then I'll back it off out of the Sear channel. This is so I can easily capture the Sear in a minute. I'll take the Apex Sear spring and I'll set it inside the factory Sear from the back with the non-bent end of the coil sitting against that little tab on the Sear. Now I'll take this assembly, holding it sideways so it doesn't fall out, and I'll drop this into the Sear housing block all the way down until it's almost in position. I'll pull the pin back enough to let the Sear go down. Once the Sear goes into position, I can put the pin back through and just barely capture the Sear with that pin. Once I'm here, I need to get my pin punch and press the Sear spring into position. I'll take my 3/32 inch pin punch, I'll put it in all the way behind the Sear and press on the Sear coil to push it down where the spring is. I'll hold it against the table for this operation until it lines up, and then I can press my Sear pin through to capture the Sear spring, like so. With my pin punch behind the Sear, I'm going to press on the Sear coil to push it down into position until it lines up with the Sear pin, and then I'll press the Sear pin into position to capture it. Once I'm most of the way through, I can press the pin all the way sub-flush, and then I can press on the Sear and make sure the Sear spring is tensioned. If your pistol does not have a magazine disconnect, your Sear housing is fully assembled. If you're reinstalling a magazine disconnect, these two components need to be installed next. I'll take the magazine disconnect plate, I'll put it in to its notch in front of the Sear, and I'll put it in until it lines up, its hole lines up, and I'll press this pin in from one side or the other. There should be no spring tension on this pin. It should go all the way down, and if it doesn't, give it a couple little wraps with your pin punch, and it should seat just sub-flush in that notch. To install the trigger bar into the trigger, take the end of the trigger bar, place it into the trigger slot, and in some cases, the pin will line up and kind of click into place, but not always. When installing the trigger pivot pin on one of our triggers, we recommend the vise method. Take your product card, put the flat side of the trigger against the card to prevent it from being scratched or damaged, and then close the vise jaws until the pin is just touching the other jaw. Now you want to wiggle the trigger bar around as you slowly close the vise to seat the pin. Once the pin's fully seated, back it off, remove it, and check if that pin is flush. If it's not, use a pin punch to final seat it. If the trigger bar pin isn't fully sub-flush, take your pin punch on top and just tap the pin down until it's just sub-flush. In this installation, we're going to be replacing the trigger return spring. The factory spring is yellow color and has a thicker wire. The Apex spring is silver and has a thinner diameter wire. The Apex trigger return spring has an open end on the small end of the spring. That hooks onto the trigger bar. I'm going to hook it on from the top and rotate it around, so when it's installed in the trigger body, the opening is in the upward position. This is critical for proper assembly. Next, we're going to install the trigger and trigger bar into the frame. Drop the trigger bar in, and it'll come to rest at a normal location. Take the unlocking block and set it in and set it down over the trigger body. Next, we're going to install the trigger pivot pin. Make sure you put the end in that has the two rings on it first, from the right side to the left. We're going to go in so we can capture the unlocking block and the trigger body with the end of that pin. The idea is to go all the way through the pin, the trigger, pull the pin back out just far enough to make space, and then we're going to press the trigger return spring in and push the pin all the way through to capture that spring. We want to have the pin sticking about 1/4 inch out of the side of the frame. With the trigger pivot pin sticking partially out of the frame, the trigger pivot pin is holding the unlocking block, the trigger body, and the trigger return spring in position for me. I'm going to pull the trigger and make sure the trigger bar is all the way up. I'll take the slide lock lever, and I'll go underneath the unlocking block and push it all the way forward until it's in position. Then I'll pull up on the front under spring tension while I press this pin in to capture the slide lock lever. Sometimes you have to wiggle it and jiggle it while you push on it. Occasionally I'll put it against the table, I'll pull pressure up as I push the frame down, and that'll allow the pin to seat most of the way. Once I'm most of the way through, it's a matter of pulling the trigger to get the trigger bar up and then pressing the pin the rest of the way through. If you press the pin in and it doesn't come all the way flush with the frame, turn the frame up and look on the inside and look at the trigger return spring. You'll notice the trigger return spring is caught on the ring on the trigger pin. All you have to do is pull the trigger to relieve tension off that, back the pin off ever so slightly, or press it back out with a punch, just a little bit, and then it should press in and clear that section. Once it's there, it'll lock in position. You should hear it click in positively. With the trigger and bar reassembled in the frame, pull the trigger and hold it down. Take the Sear housing block and take the Sear itself, take the engagement tab that sticks out and put it into the V-notch on the trigger bar. Carry that down into the frame and drop the Sear housing block all the way down in the frame. For those of you with a magazine disconnect model, these two components have to go in next. If you do not have a magazine disconnect, all you need to do is put the Sear housing pin back in and the installation is complete. Take a look at the Sear housing pin. You'll notice there are serrations on one end. Take the smooth side of the pin, put it in from the left side of the frame until it goes in just into the Sear housing far enough to get into the gap. Pull it back out so it's just flush with the inside. With the Sear housing pin sitting flush on the inside of the Sear housing, I'll take the magazine disconnect lever, fish it through the Sear all the way to the back of the Sear housing. Now I'll take the spring that came with that and set it on top. And now alignment is going to be critical. Make sure the two tabs of the spring are on the back of the Sear housing like so. They need to sit over the ledge. This is how they gain tension. You're going to use your 3/32 inch pin punch from the right side of the frame to come in and try to capture everything. But to do so, you're going to have to tension that spring first. With the spring in place on top of the magazine disconnect, I'm going to use the back of a pin punch to press down on the spring to provide tension. And at the same time, I'll go through with my other pin punch and I'll capture the springs and the takedown and the magazine disconnect all in one shot. Once you get the spring tensioned and you get the pin pushed as far as possible over, take your hammer and start tapping the pin into position, allowing your slave pin to push out. Once your knurls hit the frame, you can remove the pin punch and you can final seat the pin. We'll put it on the table and we'll tap it down. Now the pin's final seated. If you don't have a magazine disconnect, all you need to do is seat the pin down until it's flush with the side of the frame and the installation's complete. For my function check, I need to use a magazine in this case because I have a magazine disconnect model, so I have an empty magazine in the frame. I'm going to press the trigger body without pressing the safety, and you'll notice the Sear does not move. I'll press the Sear and press the safety, and you'll notice the Sear tips down. With the trigger pressed and the Sear tipped down, I'm going to press the trigger bar down on the disconnector tab. See the Sear pop back up. When I release the trigger bar should recapture the Sear and allow the Sear to come back again. This is proper function. To verify the magazine safety works, I'll remove the magazine and I'll pull the trigger. And you'll note the Sear does not move, just the trigger bar itself. This is proper function for a magazine disconnect frame. So we're going to do a final function test. I have an empty magazine in the gun because this magazine has a magazine disconnect. I'll press on the trigger body without pressing the safety and note the trigger body doesn't move far enough to fire. I'll put my finger on the safety and pull the trigger. You'll notice the pull is a bit heavier, but I'm still not getting the gun to fire. This is because in about 30% of the frames, the overtravel stop on the trigger body needs to be adjusted. So we'll go through and do that now. Because we can't pull the trigger to drop the striker, we need to be able to get the slide off. I recommend pulling the trigger and holding it down and then articulate the slide about a 1/4 inch back. You'll hear the striker drop. Now, with the magazine out, I can take the two takedown levers, pull them down, I can take the slide off the frame. Following our guide for disassembling the frame and taking the trigger body out, I recommend using your roll of tape to depress the safety while you work on the trigger. What we're going to do is we're going to press the safety down to get it out of the way, and I'm going to use my file here and I'm going to take about 0.010 of an inch off the back of the trigger body, roughly flat with the material that's already there. You're trying to take off 0.010 of an inch, 0.010. You may notice a little bit of flashing on the back corner of the trigger body, which is perfectly normal. I just take my file and knock that off, or I'll use a knife and deburr that edge as necessary. At this point, you can put it back in the frame. You can omit the parts for the magazine disconnect while you're doing this sample. Once you're done and you've confirmed the overtravel works properly, then you'll want to put your magazine disconnect components back in. After a couple of disassembly and reassemblies, we took just enough material off the back of the trigger to make it fire. So I'm going to retest it now. I'll pull the trigger body without hitting the safety, make sure it doesn't fire, put my finger on the safety and press the trigger. This time it fired. I'll hold the trigger down, reset the slide, release slowly for a reset, re-engage, and now it fires. This is proper function.